The jackhammer's rhythmic pounding echoed through the quiet suburban street as David Mitchell stood in his backyard, arms crossed, watching 15 years of family memories being pulverized into concrete dust. His swimming pool, once the centerpiece of countless summer barbecues and his children's birthdays, was being systematically demolished by a crew of 4 burly men in hard hats and reflective vests. "You sure about this, Mr. Mitchell?" Carlos, the crew foreman, shouted over the mechanical cacophony. "A lot of folks would kill for a pool like this." David nodded firmly, squinting against the late April sunshine. At 52, with his children grown and moved away to college, the pool had become nothing but a money pit, a chlorinated monument to a chapter of his life that had closed. $3,000 in annual maintenance for something he used maybe 5 times last summer. The math was simple. "Positive," David called back. "That thing's been sucking money from my wallet for years. I'm turning it into a garden and patio space, something low maintenance." What David didn't mention was how the decision had sparked heated debates with his ex-wife during their recent divorce. She'd insisted the pool increase their property value. He countered with maintenance costs and insurance premiums. In the end, the judge had sided with him. The house and all decisions regarding it were his alone now. From over the fence, David noticed his neighbor Elaine Harris watching the proceedings with undisguised disapproval. 58 and retired early from a corporate career, Elaine was the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood property values and aesthetic standards. Her immaculate yard with its precision-trimmed hedges and seasonal flower displays had won the subdivision's Garden of the Year award 3 years running. David lifted his hand in a casual wave. Elaine didn't wave back. Instead, she disappeared into her house, phone already pressed to her ear. "Looks like you've upset the queen bee," Carlos observed, following David's gaze. David shrugged. "Elaine's particular about the neighborhood, but it's my property, my decision." What David didn't know was that Elaine had appointed herself more than just guardian of property values. She was the unofficial social director of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, despite having been politely asked to step down from the actual board 2 years ago after a series of increasingly aggressive confrontations with residents over everything from mailbox colors to holiday decorations. By lunchtime, the crew had made significant progress. The concrete shell was halfway demolished, and the specialized equipment for removing the buried pipes and filtration systems stood ready for the afternoon's work. David brought out sandwiches and cold drinks for the workers, feeling lighter with each chunk of concrete hauled away. Just as they were finishing lunch, the unmistakable wail of sirens pierced the suburban quiet, growing steadily louder. David frowned, setting down his sandwich. "Wonder what's going on," he muttered, walking toward his front yard. He stepped through his side gate just in time to see 2 police cruisers pulling up directly in front of his house, lights flashing. The officers emerged cautiously, hands resting near their belts, scanning the scene with professional vigilance. One of them, a broad-shouldered officer with a salt and pepper crew cut, approached. His nameplate read Williams. "Afternoon, sir. Are you the homeowner?" Officer Williams asked, expression carefully neutral. "Yes, that's me. David Mitchell. Is there a problem?" Officer Williams glanced at his partner, then back at David, his professional demeanor slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of exasperation. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, we received a rather urgent 911 call about alleged illegal activity and destruction of property occurring at this address." Behind them, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, Elaine Harris watched with her arms crossed and a vindicating smile on her face. David's confusion quickly transformed into understanding as he caught sight of Elaine's triumphant expression from across the street. The pieces clicked into place, and he felt his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. "I'm guessing my neighbor called you," David said, gesturing discreetly toward Elaine, who was now making her way across the street with purposeful strides, phone still clutched in her hand like evidence. "I'm not destroying property, at least not illegally. I'm removing my swimming pool. On my own property. With all the proper permits." Officer Williams' partner, a younger officer with the name Rodriguez on her badge, was already taking in the scene with practiced eyes. "Mind if we take a look at those permits, sir?" "Not at all," David replied, relieved he kept the folder of paperwork on the kitchen counter. "Please come in." As they turned toward the house, Elaine inserted herself into the conversation with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Officers, I'm Elaine Harris. I called because this man is destroying valuable neighborhood property and threatening our community standards," she announced, her voice carrying for the benefit of several neighbors who had emerged from their homes to witness the commotion. The Oakwood Estates Covenant clearly states that all external property modifications must be approved by the Architectural Committee. Officer Williams maintained his professional demeanor, though David noticed a subtle tightening around his eyes. "Ma'am, we're just going to verify the homeowner's permits. If you could give us a moment." "I have chaired that committee for 7 years," Elaine continued as if he hadn't spoken. And I can assure you, no approval was granted for removing a swimming pool. Do you realize what this will do to property values? This is precisely why we have rules. Inside the house, David retrieved the thick folder containing his permits, contractor agreements, and most importantly, a letter from the actual current president of the HOA confirming that his pool removal project had been reviewed and approved last month. He handed the folder to Officer Rodriguez, who began methodically examining each document. Everything appears to be in order, Officer Rodriguez said after a thorough review. City permits, HOA approval, licensed contractor. You've done your homework, Mr. Mitchell. David allowed himself a small smile. I've lived here 15 years. I know how things work. When they returned outside, Elaine was mid-lecture about neighborhood standards to a visibly uncomfortable Officer Williams. 3 more neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the drama unfold with undisguised interest. Ma'am, Officer Williams interrupted firmly, we've reviewed Mr. Mitchell's documentation. He has all the necessary permits and approvals for this project, including written permission from the Homeowners Association. Elaine's expression flickered between disbelief and outrage. That's impossible. I would have known about it. I review all architectural submissions. According to this letter, Officer Rodriguez said, holding up the HOA approval, you're no longer on the architectural committee, Ms. Harris. This was approved by the current committee chair, Mr. James Thornton. The neighbors watching from across the street exchanged glances and whispers. David felt a twinge of sympathy for Elaine as her face reddened, but it quickly dissolved when she squared her shoulders and doubled down. There must be some mistake. Regardless, removing a pool decreases property values by up to 20%. He's damaging all of our investments. That should be criminal. Officer Williams' professional veneer finally cracked, revealing a flash of the human beneath the uniform. He removed his sunglasses and pinched the bridge of his nose before addressing Elaine directly. Ms. Harris, I need to be very clear about something. Calling 911 is for emergencies, situations where lives are in danger or crimes are in progress. A neighbor legally modifying his own property with all proper permits is neither an emergency nor a crime. But, Elaine began. No, ma'am, please let me finish. Officer Williams continued, his tone firm but not unkind. Misuse of emergency services is actually a punishable offense. In cases like this, callers can be fined up to $1,000 for improper use of the 911 system. Officer Rodriguez nodded in agreement. We take these calls very seriously. While we're here dealing with a non-emergency, we could be delayed in responding to someone facing a genuine crisis. The gathered neighbors had fallen silent, and even the construction crew had paused their work to witness the exchange. David saw Carlos suppressing a smile as he pretended to check something on his clipboard. Elaine's mouth opened and closed several times before she finally found her voice again. I was simply trying to protect our community, she said, but her righteous indignation had deflated considerably. Someone had to take action. The appropriate action would have been to check with your HOA or the city permit office, Officer Rodriguez suggested gently. Or perhaps to have a conversation with your neighbor first. I'm issuing you a warning today, Officer Williams added, removing a small notepad from his pocket. But I want to be clear that any future non-emergency calls to 911 could result in formal charges. Do you understand? As Elaine nodded stiffly, looking thoroughly put in her place, David couldn't help but notice that the neighborhood audience was no longer trying to hide their interest. Several were openly smiling, and one elderly gentleman across the street gave David a subtle thumbs up. As the police cruisers pulled away from the curb, the subtle dynamics of Oakwood Estates had shifted like tectonic plates beneath their feet. David stood in his driveway, watching Elaine retreat to her house with rigid posture and wounded dignity. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle were dispersing, but not before several of them caught David's eye with knowing looks or small nods of solidarity. Susan Rodriguez from across the street actually approached him, something she hadn't done in the 2 years since Elaine had criticized her Halloween decorations as excessive and tacky. That was something else, Susan said, glancing over her shoulder to ensure Elaine had fully disappeared inside her house. Been a long time coming, if you ask me. David raised an eyebrow. You've had run-ins with her too? Susan laughed, a short, sharp sound. Who hasn't? Last summer, she left a typed note in my mailbox, a full page, mind you, explaining why my bird feeder was attracting undesirable wildlife and compromising the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. She rolled her eyes. There was a ceramic cardinal David, hand-painted. She reported my wind chimes, offered Martin Chen, who lived 2 doors down, joining their impromptu gathering. Said they created noise pollution and violated some obscure covenant from 1997. The HOA president had to personally tell her that wind chimes were, in fact, permitted. One by one, neighbors shared their Elaine's stories, each more ridiculous than the last. The red roses that weren't the approved shade of red. The basketball hoop that was 2 inches taller than regulation. The mailbox flag that was excessively reflective. For the first time since moving to Oakwood Estates, David felt a genuine connection with his neighbors. They weren't just the people who lived in proximity to him. They were fellow survivors of Hurricane Elaine. After the neighbors departed and the construction crew resumed work, David retreated to his home office to catch up on emails. The confrontation had eaten into his workday, and he had a project deadline looming. But his concentration was repeatedly broken by the chime of his phone, notifying him of new neighborhood app messages. Curious, he opened the app to find a thread titled Pool Removal Drama with dozens of comments. Someone, he suspected Martin, had given a play-by-play of the police incident without naming names, though it was abundantly clear who the main characters were. The thread had quickly evolved into a support group for Karen survivors, with residents from all corners of Oakwood Estates sharing their experiences with overzealous enforcement of imaginary rules. David was contemplating whether to contribute his own story when a knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find James Thornton, the actual AOA president, standing on his porch with an apologetic expression. "Hey, David, got a minute?" James asked, shifting uncomfortably. He was a mild-mannered accountant who had taken on the AOA leadership role with the reluctance of someone drawing the short straw. "I wanted to apologize for today's situation." David waved him in. "Not your fault. Coffee." Pleased, James sighed, following David to the kitchen. "Though I feel partially responsible. We should have made it clearer to Elaine that she's no longer on the architectural committee when we restructured last year." "Would it have made a difference?" David asked, handing James a steaming mug. James considered this, blowing thoughtfully on his coffee. "Probably not. She still has all the committee meeting minutes from 2016 laminated and organized in binders." "That's dedicated," David said diplomatically. "That's one word for it," James replied with a small smile. "The thing is, we've actually had several complaints about her in recent months. Nothing actionable, just her inserting herself into other people's property decisions, claiming authority she doesn't have." "Like calling the police on a permitted pool removal?" David suggested wryly. "Exactly like that," James nodded. "But this is the first time it's escalated to involving law enforcement. The board is meeting tomorrow evening, and I wanted to give you a heads up that this will be discussed. We'd appreciate it if you'd attend." David's stomach tightened. He'd successfully avoided HOA meetings for the entirety of his 15 years in the neighborhood. "Am I in some kind of trouble? All my permits are in order." No, James assured him quickly. "You're completely in the clear. We're actually considering implementing some new guidelines about neighbor disputes and when it's appropriate to involve authorities. Your perspective would be valuable." After James left, David returned to his backyard to check on the pool demolition progress. The crew had managed to remove most of the concrete shell, and Carlos was supervising the extraction of the filtration system. "Making good time," Carlos commented. "Despite the unexpected police visit, you got quite the neighborhood watch program here." David chuckled. "You could say that." As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across what remained of his pool, David noticed movement at Elaine's upstairs window. The curtain fell quickly back into place when he looked up, but he caught the unmistakable outline of his neighbor, watching the destruction of what she considered a neighborhood asset. For a moment, David felt a twinge of something like guilt. Elaine clearly believed she was protecting the community, even if her methods were misguided and intrusive. But then he remembered the faces of his neighbors as they shared their stories, the silent solidarity of people who had endured years of unsolicited criticism and interference. His phone chime began with another neighborhood app notification. The thread had grown to over 100 comments, and someone had suggested a block party that weekend, the first in years, to celebrate spring and community spirit. The location? David's newly pool-free backyard. The suggestion had received enthusiastic support, with neighbors offering to bring food, drinks, and lawn games. Even James had chimed in, making it semi-official by offering whole funds for basic supplies. David smiled to himself. His pool removal project had inadvertently accomplished something the neighborhood had needed for years. It had given the residents of Oakwood Estates a common cause and broken the invisible barriers that had kept them isolated in their separate homes. He glanced once more at Elaine's window, now dark and still, and wondered if she would attend the block party. Despite everything, he found himself hoping she might. David arrived at the Oakwood Estates Community Center 15 minutes before the scheduled HOA meeting, surprised to find the parking lot nearly full. In his 15 years as a resident, he'd never attended a meeting, but James had mentioned they typically drew about a dozen of the neighborhood's most dedicated members, usually the same faces each month. Tonight, however, the small meeting room was packed to capacity. Folding chairs had been hastily arranged in rows, and residents stood along the walls, murmuring in small groups. David recognized faces he'd never seen at neighborhood functions before, including several of the neighbors who had shared their Elaine stories the day before. "Quite the turnout," Martin Chen commented, appearing at David's side and handing him a styrofoam cup of watery coffee. "Word got around." "About the pool thing?" David asked, scanning the room. Martin grinned. "Let's just say your little incident has become a catalyst for some long-overdue community discussion." At the front of the room, James Thornton and the other 4 HOA board members looked simultaneously overwhelmed and excited by the unprecedented attendance. They huddled together, occasionally glancing at the door with nervous expressions. David followed their gaze and understood their anxiety. The door remained conspicuously Elaine-free. At precisely 7:00 p.m., James called the meeting to order, his voice cracking slightly as he addressed the crowded room. "Welcome, everyone, to our April HOA meeting. It's wonderful to see so many new faces tonight," he began, shuffling papers nervously. "Before we get to our regular agenda items, I think we should address the situation that many of you have heard about regarding yesterday's incident involving a non-emergency 911 call." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and several heads turned toward David. He felt his face flush and took a long sip of the terrible coffee. "Now, I want to be clear," James continued, finding his footing. "The homeowner in question had all proper permits and HOA approvals for his project. The board stands by those approvals. What concerns us is the escalation to law enforcement without any attempt to resolve the matter through proper channels." The room fell silent as the door at the back opened and Elaine Harris entered. Unlike her usual impeccably coordinated outfits and carefully styled hair, tonight she wore a simple cardigan and slacks, her hair pulled back in a functional ponytail. She scanned the room, noticing the unusually large crowd, and her steps faltered momentarily before she squared her shoulders and proceeded to the only remaining seat, ironically, next to David. "As I was saying," James continued after a brief, awkward pause, "the board is proposing a new addition to our community guidelines regarding dispute resolution. We've drafted a simple 3-step process that we believe will prevent future misunderstandings." As James outlined the proposal, which essentially required residents to attempt direct conversation, then contact the HOA board before involving any outside authorities, David became acutely aware of Elaine's stiff posture beside him. She sat ramrod straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the board members. "Would anyone like to comment on this proposal?" James asked, opening the floor for discussion. To everyone's surprise, Elaine's hand was the first to rise. A hush fell over the room as James acknowledged her with a nod that betrayed his trepidation. "If I may," Elaine began, her voice lacking its usual authoritative edge, "I would like to address yesterday's incident." All eyes turned to her, and David fought the urge to sink lower in his chair. He hoped to avoid becoming the center of attention, but it seemed inevitable now. "For 15 years, Elaine continued, I have dedicated myself to maintaining the standards and property values of Oakwood Estates. I have given countless hours to this community, reviewing architectural submissions, organizing beautification initiatives, and yes, enforcing our covenants." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Yesterday, I made a significant error in judgment. I acted hastily and without following proper procedures. And while my intentions were to protect our community's standards, my methods were inappropriate." The room remained utterly silent, many residents exchanging incredulous glances. Elaine Harris admitting a mistake. It was unprecedented. "I would like to publicly apologize to Mr. Mitchell," she said, turning slightly toward David, though not quite meeting his eyes. "And to the officers whose time I wasted, and to all of you. My actions reflected poorly on our community." David found himself nodding almost automatically in acknowledgement, too surprised to formulate a proper response. The tension in the room had shifted from anticipatory to something more complex, a mixture of shock, respect for the difficulty of a public apology, and lingering skepticism. That being said, Elaine continued, a hint of her former assertiveness returning, "I still believe strongly in maintaining community standards. I propose that instead of focusing solely on a punitive approach to what happened, we use this as an opportunity to improve communication within Oakwood Estates." Several heads nodded in agreement, including, to David's surprise, his own. "Perhaps," Elaine suggested, "we could establish a community newsletter or digital bulletin board where major property modifications are announced in advance, giving neighbors the opportunity to ask questions or express concerns in a constructive forum before work begins." James blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off his prepared agenda by this unexpected constructive suggestion from Elaine. "That's actually a very good idea, Elaine. We've been discussing something similar for a while. I'd be willing to help implement it," offered Susan Rodriguez, raising her hand. "I have experience with community engagement platforms from my work." What followed was the most productive HOA meeting in Oakwood Estates history, according to several longtime residents. Ideas flowed freely, with neighbors who had never spoken at meetings before offering suggestions for improving community communication, organizing social events, and yes, updating architectural guidelines to reflect modern preferences while maintaining neighborhood character. Throughout the discussion, David observed Elaine gradually relaxing beside him, occasionally nodding at suggestions or jotting notes. When the meeting concluded after nearly 2 hours, she gathered her things and turned to him. "Your garden plans," she said quietly. "The ones replacing the pool. Would you be open to some suggestions? I have experience with drought-resistant perennials that might work well in that space." It wasn't quite a peace offering, but it was something. David found himself nodding. "I could use the advice," he admitted. "I'm better with spreadsheets than plants." As they walked toward the parking lot together, surrounded by energized neighbors still buzzing with community improvement ideas, David realized that the void left by his removed pool was being filled with something unexpected. A sense of genuine connection to the place he'd lived for 15 years but never truly felt part of until now. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect spring day for Oakwood Estates' first neighborhood block party in over 5 years. David stood in his backyard, marveling at the transformation that had occurred in just a few days. Where his pool that once dominated the space, there was now a level expanse of fresh soil, waiting for the landscaping to begin the following week. Carlos and his crew had finished the demolition ahead of schedule, even helping to spread the topsoil as a courtesy after David had mentioned the upcoming party. "Looks different, doesn't it?" came a voice from behind him. David turned to find Martin Chen holding a folding table, his wife Jessica following with a stack of chairs. "We thought you might need some extra seating," Jessica explained. "Also, fair warning, I made enough Korean fried chicken to feed half the neighborhood." "Which is convenient," Martin added with a grin, "since half the neighborhood is coming." They weren't exaggerating. By noon, David's yard and driveway had transformed into a vibrant community hub. Folding tables lined the perimeter, laden with an international potluck feast that reflected Oakwood Estates' diverse residents. Children darted between groups of adults engaged in an elaborate game of tag that seemed to have rules only they understood. A portable speaker played an eclectic playlist that Susan Rodriguez had created, featuring everyone's song contributions. James Thornton had set up a community vision board on an easel where residents were encouraged to post sticky notes with ideas for neighborhood improvements. The colorful mosaic of suggestions ranged from practical, monthly neighborhood cleanup day to ambitious, community vegetable garden in the empty lot on Maple Street, to humorous, less drama, more margaritas. David found himself playing host more naturally than he'd expected, introducing neighbors who had lived mere houses apart for years without ever really speaking. The artificial boundaries that had kept them isolated were dissolving in the sunshine, over shared food and conversation. "You throw a good party for someone who just destroyed the neighborhood's premier swimming spot," Officer Williams commented good-naturedly, appearing at David's side with a plate piled high with food. "Officer Williams," David exclaimed, surprised, "I didn't expect to see you here." The police officer chuckled. "Mike, please. I'm off duty, and I live just around the corner in Willow Creek Estates. Your HOA president invited me, said something about building positive community police relations." He gestured with his fork toward James, who was deep in conversation with an elderly couple David had never spoken to before. "Well, welcome," David said, genuinely pleased. "Though I hope this visit involves fewer accusations of criminal activity. The only crime I'm investigating today is who made this incredible brisket," Mike replied, taking another bite. "That would be the Goldsteins from number 327, David informed him. "Former Texans who haven't stopped reminding us about it since they moved here 12 years ago." As the afternoon progressed, David found himself gravitating toward the newly installed garden in the front corner of his yard, a small but vibrant display of native flowering plants surrounding a stone bench. It had appeared mysteriously yesterday afternoon while he was at work, accompanied only by a carefully printed card that read, "A neighborhood welcome gift." He had recognized Elaine's initials immediately and had been both touched and perplexed by the gesture. When he texted to thank her, her response had been characteristically efficient. "The baptisia will attract butterflies. The echinacea is drought-resistant, water deeply, not frequently." Speaking of Elaine, David realized he hadn't seen her at the party yet. He scanned the crowd, wondering if she had chosen to stay away, when he spotted her standing somewhat awkwardly at the side gate, holding a covered dish and observing the festivities with an unreadable expression. David made his way through the crowd to greet her. "You came," he said simply. "I brought deviled eggs," she replied, lifting the dish slightly. "My grandmother's recipe." David smiled. "Well, that's a relief. We were dangerously low on deviled eggs. Only had about 4 varieties so far." A flicker of amusement crossed Elaine's face before she glanced around at the bustling yard. Quite the turnout. It's turned into something bigger than I expected, David admitted. People seem to need this. Elaine nodded thoughtfully. The pandemic isolated us, and we never quite found our way back to being a community. Even before that, we were just houses near each other, not truly neighbors. She straightened her shoulders slightly. I may have contributed to that problem with my approach to community standards. Before David could respond, Susan Rodriguez spotted them and approached with determined cheer. Elaine, you made it. She gestured to the dish. Are those your famous deviled eggs? The ones you brought to the 2018 holiday potluck? I've been dreaming about them ever since. David watched as surprise, then pleasure crossed Elaine's face. You remember that? Are you kidding? They had that perfect hint of horseradish. I tried to recreate them for months. Susan took the dish. Come on, these need a place of honor on the food table. As Susan led Elaine away, David noticed something he hadn't seen before. Elaine Harris was more than just the neighborhood watchdog. She was a woman who made memorable deviled eggs, who knew which plants attracted butterflies, who had devoted years of her life to a community that had largely relegated her to the role of nuisance. Throughout the afternoon, David observed Elaine gradually integrating into various conversation groups. There was initial awkwardness, certainly, but it was offset by the general mood of goodwill and the social lubricant of good food and sunshine. He noticed that while some neighbors were clearly still wary, others, particularly newer residents who hadn't experienced the full force of her rule enforcement, seemed genuinely interested in her encyclopedic knowledge of the neighborhood's history. As evening approached and the party showed no signs of winding down, fairy lights strung earlier by Martin's teenage sons flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Someone had brought out a portable fire pit, and a group had formed around it, roasting marshmallows and sharing increasingly embellished stories about neighborhood legends. David found himself at the periphery of his own party, contentedly observing the community that had somehow formed in the void left by his swimming pool. Mike Williams had joined him, both men nursing cold beers in comfortable silence. You know, Mike said eventually, in 15 years on the force, I've responded to more neighbor disputes than I can count. Most end in restraining orders or moving vans. Not exactly heading that direction here, David observed. Mike nodded toward where Elaine sat with the Goldsteins, earnestly discussing what appeared to be garden design, judging by the hand gestures. People surprise you sometimes, especially when given the chance to save face and contribute positively. I'm still not entirely sure how we got from her calling 911 on me to David gestured at the party around them. Community, Mike supplied. And it happens more often than you'd think. Sometimes people just need a reset button. He raised his beer bottle slightly, though usually it doesn't require demolishing a swimming pool. David laughed. If I'd known that was all it would take, I might have done it years ago. As the evening deepened and stars appeared overhead, David recognized that something fundamental had shifted in Oakwood Estates. The neighborhood had a pulse now, a sense of shared identity that extended beyond property values and adherence to covenants. And somehow, his split-second decision to remove an underused pool had been the catalyst.